So today here I am with Richard Osborne, my dear friend, whom I never actually met. Hi, Richard.
Good evening, Victoria. How are
Yeah,
you?
sure. I'm good. I'm actually drinking whiskey and Coke because Richard and I met at Space Bar. So to celebrate that, I have a whiskey and Coke. Richard never drinks anything when Space Bar's on, and tonight, he has a coffee.
There's a good reason for this because I know the last thing I want to do is come on and give a drunken rant on anything I come on to about space. Given that I rant enough as it is, it hardly needs to be a drunken rant to add to that.
Well, I don't think you would give a drunken rant anyway. Okay, before I ask you, my first question is going to be what spacebar is, so that everyone knows what we're talking about. But before I ask that question, I just want to give a shout out to Tasha, who gave me these lovely earrings. She's never seen them in my ears, so I have to I have to thank her, Dr. Nicholson. Thank you, and also shout out to David for my JWST James Webb Telescope pin. Thank you very much. And now back to Richard. So, what is spacebar? How would you define spacebar to those who've never seen it?
Um, it's a regular meeting that's held for anyone who's interested in space, not just people who are in the space industry, but anyone who is interested in space, full stop. The idea is we wanted to create an opportunity for people to be able to come together and talk about space related activities. Um, Basically, because at the time when it was formed, the lockdown had started, so people didn't have any way of meeting up. So we knew that was going to curtail various space activities, whether it was people attending events, conferences, or meeting up for essentially talking about space in the pub. So the whole idea behind Spacebar was to have a way that people could talk about space whilst they were busy going stir crazy during lockdown. Um, and it grew from that. Initially, it was fairly informal. It was
Yes,
fairly off the wall
yes.
as it goes. And gradually over time, it has become ever more, um, I wouldn't say necessarily formal, but it's become more focused in the way that there's now regular talks that are given on each space bar for the first hour. And then the bar is open, so to speak, after that
Oh, yeah.
uh, for anyone to talk about anything they want, although preferably about space. Um, I think what's also helped is the fact that we've got some tremendous presenters, um, and Dallas Campbell and Professor Susie Imber really are exceptional because uh, they live and breathe space anyway, and they love technology. So they've got this great overview of anything to do with space. Uh, so that infectious enthusiasm comes across when we have the space bar events, and then there's a good team behind that as well. There's at the moment we've got Vic Southgate, who's been around and involved in space for many years and is incredibly enthusiastic and knowledgeable.
Yes.
And we've got Torsten, who has come on board to provide an analysis of the space industry. So bringing another aspect in for everyone, to basically to inform everyone, give them more information on what's going on out there.
Yeah, Thorsten Kriening, my previous boss. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yes, and we have Andy Campbell as well, who is taking care of the startup ideas.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's a relatively new thing that we've
yeah,
got the whole startup thing, and it's good having someone of Andy's caliber on board, because he's able to question people, um, in terms of in terms of understanding what a potential startup business needs, and how credible anything that they're doing may be.
yeah, sure. Yeah, so Spacebar is organized by AstroAgency.
It is indeed.
You are the Chief Technology Officer. Now, Mr. Officer, who I want to be president of the world, but I know you don't want that. Could you explain how you got into space and how you ended up at AstroAgency?
Yes, by a very, very long and convoluted process. Um, Essentially, I've always wanted to be involved with space, since I was very small, and that's not that I was an alien or something. It's just I've grown over time, and initially I wanted to be an astronaut, like most kids who like space probably want to do anyway. Um,
You
and
can
that,
still be an astronaut.
well, yeah, I could do now, but it would I'd need to do it by paying to do it at this point. But at the time, I was very, very focused on it. I used to write to NASA, and in fairness, they were really, really good. They always used to humour me with some quite mad uh, ideas, and it kind of shaped the fact that I decided I had to go down the physics route in order to become an astronaut, and everything I did was focused around that, and trying to get a physics degree and so on and so forth. Um, so that shaped where I was going in terms of education. Um, but one of the problems was I was too focused on space and not enough necessarily on studying all the time at the time. And at the time, I didn't do as well as I should have done with my exams. My plan had been to go off and do astrophysics at university, um, but I messed up essentially, and the end result was doing straight physics. I say messing up and ending up doing straight physics, but given I live and breathe physics, it's hardly an imposition.
Yeah.
It's hardly it's a fallback option because it was something that I loved anyway. So I went off. I did physics, and during the physics degree, my first physics degree, I got an opportunity to work on a project that was looking at space-related phenomena. It was a gamma ray spectrometer. So I was working on that out in industry, which was very, very interesting. And that was essentially my first taste of working on any professional space-related project. But it has to be said that I'd had engagement before that through the British Interplanetary Society. And in fact, I joined the BIS back in 1983. And because of that always kept a focus in terms of what was going on in space and what I wanted to do the right thing. So the BIS was very, very helpful in terms of helping decide my course of action. Not so much at the time the people who were running the BIS, who I think there was an inbuilt dislike of anyone under the age of 60 at the time. Um, so this young guy, really enthusiastic, wasn't something that they were really didn't come across as keen on. But I learned an awful lot through space flight, because you've got to bear in mind that back then the World Wide Web didn't exist, so it was a very different situation. You had to get your information from publications, essentially.
Yeah, and Spaceflight is the BIS's magazine, who I had
Yeah,
the opportunity to write for.
yeah, absolutely. I remember reading it as well, reading the article as well.
Thank
So
you.
I think it's very, very useful to have organisations like the BIS, which help nurture people's interest in space. Everything's very, very different now from where it was in the past, and now it's incredibly welcoming
Yes.
for people of all ages and all backgrounds. So yeah, it comes highly recommended. And in fact, at some of the places where I've worked previously, being a member of the BIS, if that's seen on your CV, that actually goes down well in terms of showing that you're genuinely interested in space.
Sure.
So I from there, um, essentially taking all that knowledge, uh, I decided at the end of the physics degree that I was probably going to go off and do a PhD um, in something physics related that might help me with going to space. Um, but there was a slight challenge in that the research I'd done um, for the physics degree was on quantum mechanics. And the reason it was on quantum mechanics is because they didn't trust me because I wanted to build a rocket for my final year project. And they
Why
just
am I
didn't,
not surprised?
yeah, and they didn't trust me in terms of what I was going to do with the rocket. In the end, a quantum mechanics project was imposed on me, which wasn't actually a bad thing because it kept me off the streets, it kept me busy, and it's extremely mathematical. And the mathematical side of things was something that was really, really, really good training anyway.
Sure.
But the end result was I couldn't at that point decide what I was going to do next, apart from a PhD. But because I got the social degree grade, which a 2-2, um, it meant that ideally I needed to do a master's degree anyway. And I saw an opportunity through a friend who'd been on the same physics degree as me, to do a master's degree in remote sensing.
Mm.
And at the time, remote sensing wasn't really commercial, but it was an area that was interesting because it covered a lot of different areas of science generally. So I went off to do that, and in the course of doing that, we had a lecture given to us by a visiting delegation from St. Petersburg who had been working on the Phobos 2 Mars mission. And at the end of the lecture they gave about the Phobos 2 Mars mission, they said, are there any questions? And knowing that I had a 6-month research component as part of the master's degree, I put my hand up and said, yeah, can I come out and work on your data? Being cheeky. And they said yes.
Wow.
And the lecturers, I think they felt, wow, we'll send him out there. We get peace and quiet then. And he can go off and be well away from us. So I was very, very fortunate in having some very, very supportive lecturers who really, really did want to make the most of this opportunity for us to get hold of Mars data. And it was quite interesting data as well, because the Phobos 2 Mars mission didn't work for particularly long when it got to Mars. Essentially, it went dead just after its first pass. But in that first pass, it got some very, very interesting thermal data. Interesting insofar as the only previous thermal data we had of the Martian surface was the Viking data from the mid-1970s. So it was a fantastic way of comparing the two. So in the process of doing the research, I also made myself an annoyance with NASA JPL as well, and a very, very helpful research chap out there. And the end result was my thesis was then on the Martian surface and atmospheric impact on the Martian surface. So that's where I learned all about atmospheres for climate and so on, because of working on a planetary atmosphere. And if you can do it with Mars, it's you've got far more atmosphere to work with on the Earth, obviously, because the Martian atmosphere at essentially at ground level on Mars is, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it's something about 7 millibars. So it's very, very low compared to the Earth, which is on average the high hundreds of millibars. Obviously, it varies on a day-to-day basis. So that's how I got into all this. And then what happened was I saw an opening for a job working at University College London on, again, hopefully being able to use the Mars data, although that wasn't really the case, but it was essentially a remote sensing research role. And in the process, that's how I got involved with UK SEDS back in, it would have been about 1993. And in fact, the way I got involved with UK SEDS was I'd found out that they'd launched a rocket the year before. And I was rather annoyed that they'd not got anything out in terms of marketing and publicity. About it. So I didn't know it had launched. All I knew is they were doing this rocket project and I could find no way of getting in touch with them. So I introduced myself to them at Astrofest in 1993, and said, "I've been trying to get in touch with you. I've found no way that anyone will get back to me, will respond. So I'm building a rocket to shoot your rocket down." At which point they said, "Well, that's going to be a bit difficult because we launched it last summer." Um, and that kind of broke the ice, and that's how we got chatting to them about potential rocket projects, and then from that, a hybrid rocket program looking at building a space-capable sounding rocket emerged. The work at UCL came to an end. I went to work for the absolutely wonderful Professor Heinz Wolf at Brunel Institute for Bioengineering on a mission to the Mir space station. And we were working on something called BioKit for Euromir 95. But one of the problems when you're launching any payload which involves humans or not alike is you've got to be very, very careful on the masses. And this particular mission had some issues around mass. So the first thing that got junked was the UK payload. Mm-hmm. So that brought that to an end. And at the time, this was also when the World Wide Web was just starting. It had started a couple of years before, and I remember using it in '93 when the first Netscape came out. And I realized this could be interesting. Don't know where it's going to go. So I moved into the IT world, realizing that the IT world is well paid. I'm not getting anywhere in terms of job applications for the space industry because I'd been trying very hard, sending out a ridiculous number of letters to get jobs in the space industry, but getting nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. And 9 times out of 10, no one would respond anyway. So I thought, okay, right, well, I'm going to have to tackle this a different way. One of those ways was through this rocket project, and another way was through using money I made in the IT sector to try and build up leverage so I could develop my own space company. So that was always my plan, and I started along that route, and things were going reasonably well. We were launching various rockets, setting records in terms of launching the first hybrid, firing the largest hybrid rocket, and later a bunch of more crazy rockets.
Rocket Club Hungary as well.
Well, that was later. Yeah, that was later. But essentially, at this point, I was still juggling essentially space and IT in parallel, but getting very heavily involved in launching the smaller rockets, especially what are called hybrid rockets, which have a liquid oxidizer and a solid fuel. And the reason for working on those is because they're generally fairly safe if you treat them properly. If you don't treat them properly, like anything, if you've got a strong oxidizer and it's under pressure, it's going to go bang. So you have to be respectful of anything you're working with rockets. So working on that kept me busy. But I was still very, very keen to get back into space as a regular day job rather than a sideline job. But it was still the same issue of sending letters off and not getting anywhere. And a lot of this was because of the fact that if you had any involvement in launch back in the 1990s, and even into the 2000s in the UK, the environment was positively hostile. And this is why we lost so much in terms of talent. There, I could find 20 people off the top of my head right now in the UK who I could ask, can you go design a liquid rocket engine? And they could do it and come back to me within days, and they'll have something absolutely perfect. But they're gone. They're gone from the industry, and they're not coming back. Or they're gone. They're not even in the never got into the industry because they never got the opportunity. And I remember saying to people in the space industry at the time that you're going to lose a generation. You've really got to look after people, otherwise it's going to hollow out later. No one listened.
Why was the environment so hostile? What do you think?
I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. One is vested interests. There were a bunch of companies that weren't working in launch, who essentially wanted the industry for themselves. They wanted the market for themselves. So they didn't want launch to have money because it would take it away from them with what they were promoting at the time. The reality is what they were promoting at the time was still technologically sufficiently immature that it was going to be the best part of 15, 20 years before it really, really started making inroads commercially. So that was part of the reason. And the other reason was, in part, I think it was due to someone at a government department at a high level. And I've spoken to a few people about this who think that this may be the case, that there was someone essentially who was blocking government support for launch, and that made it an awful lot harder. That, in fact, is why I'm so supportive of the UK Space Agency, because when the UK Space Agency started in 2010 or so, the whole environment for launch changed massively. It was like a complete reversal, and suddenly there was genuine support, and it was genuine. And it was not quite an overnight thing, but it was as good as overnight. And that made a huge difference because suddenly it didn't necessarily need money putting in. It just needed that moral support, which had been lacking from the industry, and lacking from government. So having that made a huge difference. And then essentially industry started noticing launch more and more. And in fact, I got back into launch, oh gosh, when was it? Originally, what initiated it would have been going to an event called the British Rocketry Oral History Project, which was held at Charterhouse School every Easter. And it was an absolutely wonderful event, dearly missed because it was a very informal conference. It had a very nice, friendly feel, and the people who attended that were a lot of the people who worked on the rocket behind you at the moment, and with your with your background there, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was people who'd worked on things like that, and they had seen what had happened and this hollowing out. So they were very, very supportive, very keen to help the younger generation in terms of trying to keep some of that knowledge and keep the flame alive. And this was before the complete change and support for launch. So they were incredibly helpful. And it was whilst I was there that I got chatting to Alan Bond of Reaction Engines, the great one, and it was essentially what had happened was and I say we, it was myself and a chap called James McFarlane from Airborne Engineering, who's essentially an absolute genius when it comes to anything to do with rockets and electronics. Absolute genius. And he'd developed a hovering gyro-stabilized gimbaled rocket. It was very, very small, which makes it even harder to do it at a very small scale. And he was powering this thing on long burn solid rocket motors, which was incredibly impressive. And we got talking to someone at this event, this BROP event, and the person we were talking to said, well, of course, you can't throttle a hybrid rocket motor, because we were talking about controlling hybrid rocket motors. At which point I said, well, actually, yes, you can. And you can even control them and make things hover. And he looked at us and said, really? And out of James McFarlane's rucksack, he pulls out a throttleable hybrid rocket motor in very nice purple anodized aluminium. Looked very impressive. And a gyro-stabilized gimbaled rocket without the rocket motor on it. And he switched it on because it was all connected with the batteries and everything. And he showed that as you moved it, the gimbal moved around underneath it, so it would keep the rocket stable if it was hovering. And the chap we were talking to said, it's very interesting. I think you need to talk to Alan. And that was how we ended up having a talk to Alan Bond in the canteen of Charterhouse School, along with his colleagues and co-founders, Richard Varfill and John Scott. And the end result was he asked us if we'd be interested in static testing, a air-breathing, hydrogen-fueled rocket engine. And I think that probably took about 3 picoseconds for me to answer that. And then the bit that followed that, and he said, well, I don't know how much funding will be available, how much money we'll have for that. And we looked at him and said, what, you're going to pay us? You want to pay us to test a rocket engine? Seriously? And yeah, at this point, he already knew we were kindred spirits, and yeah, it kind of developed from there, and we ended up static testing this wonderful rocket engine. It took about a year from initial design to getting it tested, and that's how I got involved with working with for the quite wonderful Reaction Engines for a number of years. And then, having worked on just about everything for them, ranging from the nacelle test vehicle, which we were looking at, to a rocket that would have tested one of their nozzle configurations, looking at re-entry, looking at interesting missions that you could do in orbit, and their proposed orbital upper stage. I then went on to do a bunch of consultancy on launch vehicles, and especially on things to do with trajectory modeling, which I had quite a bit of experience of going back to the mid-90s. And in fact, probably the most pressing of those things was working out how to launch a human carrying rocket from the middle of Budapest, without it landing on the city,
Yeah.
and managing to get it to land in the River Danube. That was probably the most challenging trajectory analysis and simulation I've ever had to do.
I'm so gutted I didn't see that. So gutted. But I just realized the age difference between us now that you walked me through your life. I was born in 85.
Ah, okay.
I just realized.
Yeah.
Yeah. And is that so rockets, you worked on a lot of rockets and you were a consultant and you launched rockets from Budapest, and fake rockets from Budapest as well. Um, but is that how you ended up at Skyrora, where you had this lovely
That
rocket?
came later. That came a
Right.
lot later. I was doing some work for a space consultancy company called CST, and it was whilst I was doing the work for them, they were the ones who were working with Skyrora at the time when Skyrora started up, and I got introduced to Daniel Smith, and well, I got introduced to Daniel and Dasha, who I then came to work with at Skyrora, because it was just very attractive to be working on an orbital vehicle, because
What is orbital?
yeah, I mean, the thing is, you see, I'd worked on sounding rockets, space capable sounding rocket developments, and in fact launched stuff that was quite interesting. And I'd worked on a single stage to orbit spaceplane project, so I understood that side of it quite well. So the opportunity to then extend that and work on a small sat orbital launcher was incredibly attractive. And the thing is, because I live and breathe anything to do with rockets anyway, or anything to do with space, full stop, it meant that I completely got what they were trying to do, and the whole concept around it. So that's how I ended up then going and working for Skyrora, and working on the small rockets, which were really quite important, because one of the problems by losing a couple of generations of people in terms of having the experience and the skills with launching rockets in the UK is it meant there's very few who have the experience. So you have to train people up, and you have to train them up fairly rapidly. And a very, very good way of doing that is using the smaller rockets, using solid rocket motors or hybrid rocket motors. And then people learn, they learn what's involved with the launch operations, because whilst they differ in terms of scale, fundamentally it's that you need to do the same sorts of things. You need to make sure the rocket is safe. You've got all the ejection systems, all the charges primed and armed and so on. You need to liaise with the Civil Aviation Authority. You need to liaise with the Met Office to make sure you've got the weather information, so you're launching safely. These are all broadly similar. So if you're training people up so they learn these things on the smaller rockets, it increases your confidence level in terms of knowing that when they come to launching the bigger rockets, they're going to have more understanding of the process. So that was the value of working on or pushing towards developing the small rockets. I don't deny if it had been up to me, I'd have had an entire reusable launch program underway. But it wasn't, so I couldn't. But I did get to work with some absolutely wonderful people, and I've got tremendous love for the Ukrainian team, who were absolutely phenomenal, incredibly talented people, and that then fed across into the UK team, which built from this ground up pretty much with this tremendous enthusiasm, but driven by a very, very talented UK rocket engineer, a guy called Dr. J.J. Marlowe, who is exceptionally good at what he does. And the end result was, yeah, that's gone from strength to strength. But I then got involved with AstroAgency. I was leaving Skyrora and got chatting to Daniel, and he suggested that it would be worth me talking to him about a marketing venture he was involved with, a space marketing venture. I thought, this isn't me. What do I know about it? And what he pointed out was that the problem with going to a marketing company in the space industry is they have no understanding of A, space, B, technology. And as a result of that, anything they do is likely to not hit the mark, because it is something that you really do have to get right. And Daniel's point was, and it was a brilliant point, that why not go from working on one area in which you've got quite a bit of knowledge on, to deploying your knowledge of space as a whole across the entire space industry. And because of my love of technology generally, with all sorts of other technologies, looking at ways that you can have cross-fertilization between the different the space and other advanced technology sectors. And that was incredibly attractive as a thought. And again, it didn't exactly take more than a couple of nanoseconds to say, yeah, okay, I'm in. And when he said he was working with Dasha Filichkina, who I'd worked with anyway at Skyrora, that was it. I was sold, because she's just like the most competent person I think I've ever come across. Incredibly talented. So
very intelligent and beautiful, might I add.
Yeah. But also she's just so amazingly capable of doing so many things at once. Even tonight she'll be working on space related work for AstroAgency, and she's probably out busy painting a bridge across a river somewhere whilst holding her young son and holding multiple conversations at the same time. Just phenomenally talented. and completely gets the whole space sector. So it was a tremendous team, and we've kind of been able to surf the enthusiasm we've got into building the company, and then from that, try and help the space sector, because the argument that Daniel made, again, quite brilliantly, was, look, the problem is the space industry has all these wonderful stories, but is not very good at telling the world about them. And a lot of the people in the space industry are quite modest about it. They have amazing things that they're doing, but they're not telling the world about these things. So we see it as an opportunity to try and draw out some of these wonderful things they're doing and getting that message out to the world. And that's where the technical side comes in, because you need to be able to understand what it is that's important. If a company may say, right, we're developing in this technology that's using hyperspectral sensors, and it's delivering the data down to the Earth at X band, and it's also got a UHF antenna. Well, if you don't know anything about that, you can't explain it.
Yeah.
But if you understand it, if you've worked, the fact I've worked in remote sensing anyway, as well as launch, as well as all these other things, be it CubeSats, fuel cells, all sorts of interesting things, means that you learn how to interpret that information and then be able to explain it to the world, because that's the key, being able to explain it to people. And if you give it to people who don't understand that, then understandably, they're not going to be able to pick out the important things to make that story stand out and be special.
Yeah, I know. And then I use your material to write my articles, so thank you.
You did?
Yeah, a lot of times. A lot of times, and I'm smiling because it always says at the end that get in touch with AstroAgency. I'm like, oh, I know these guys. So tell me, was it with Skyrora that you had Black Arrow right next
Yeah,
to your desk?
yeah. Black Arrow was about it was a couple of paces away from the desk when I was working on the small rockets,
That's
which was
so sweet.
immensely. It was immensely inspiring, in fact, because you could walk over and have a look at it, and you could see just how good the engineering was.
Mm.
Even though the thing has come down from high in the atmosphere and essentially bounced when it hit the ground, and crumpled at the back.
You can see that.
Yeah. When you actually look at the wiring up close, you realize
I did.
what a work it's a work of art.
I did. I touched it all.
Yeah, and it's amazing, isn't it? That
Yeah.
it is it's not only it's so intact, but it was so well done. You look at how well laid out everything was internally, and you think these people really, really were good. It's an exceptional piece of engineering. It's a triumph of engineering to build such a compact, small launch vehicle. It's just absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, I'll link in the video below that talks about the history of Black Arrow so that everyone can listen to it if they don't know. Right, so
There was actually, in fact, you've got me going on this now.
okay, okay.
There was a follow-on idea that Reaction Engines came up with, or Alan Bond from Reaction Engines came up with, for a version. This would have been back in about oh gosh, about 2012, 2013, I think, probably. And it was a rocket called Blue Boomerang. And essentially, it was a reusable Black Arrow.
All right.
And it was absolutely spectacular as a concept. I can find some information that I can send you some images and things.
That would be great. Thanks.
But it was a Black Arrow with a different set of engines, um, but the first stage was a flyback booster.
Mm.
And it wasn't a vertical flyback, it had wings and it had a jet engine. Very, very, very cool. And that would have been, in an ideal world, what I would like to see a small launcher be. Because the more we get towards reusability, the better, obviously, for the industry, um, obviously for the planet as well. But certainly in terms of having something that can fly back and land on a runway, um, that would have been quite magnificent.
I wanted to ask you about rockets, like what it takes to launch a rocket into space.
Um, that's a very, very good question. And the reason why it's a very, very good question is because a lot of people think they can do it, and they discover the hard way that it's not as easy as they thought. Um, and it depends whether it's space or orbit, uh, because orbit is vastly more difficult than launching into space. But even launching into space, it's not quite as simple as build big rocket, point at the sky, launch.
Escape
Um,
velocity, goodbye.
yeah, yeah, it's a little bit more involved than that. And a lot of the people who come in with new um, companies into the launch industry, they don't necessarily do their due diligence. Um, and this is something that's rather amazed me over the last 10, 15 years. When we used to uh, design and launch rockets before that period, um, we would always go and research things. So back when the internet was in its infancy, we'd still go to the library and we'd go and look at research
Makes
papers. We'd
sense.
we'd learn about rocket engines and then contact people who'd been involved and ask questions. And that's really important. You need to do your due diligence to see what's come before, to see if you can learn anything. And we learned an enormous amount, for instance, on hybrid rockets from what had been done previously in America. And what I've seen more recently is there seems to be a lack of that going on. And that's both in the industry and with some of the student teams as well, because you see some of the comments that people come out with. Oh yes, where is it? Ours is the best. We're the first to do this. And it's like, no, you're not. Go back and check the history
Exactly.
and look at what's been done, and you will find that almost all the things you think are the biggest or the best have already been done in the UK,
Mm.
but people just haven't bothered to look.
Yeah.
It's all there. It's on the internet. Nowadays, it's really, really easy,
Mm.
but people aren't doing that basic due diligence. And the other thing that's needed is practice. It's experience. The argument may be put forward, well, you need lots of money to launch a rocket, so you can't get the experience. And that's not necessarily the case, because we, as a team, I was involved with an organisation called Mars, the Mars Advanced Rocketry Society, for many years. And we set all sorts of records to do with hybrid rockets mainly. And what we realized early on was if you had a large rocket, say you've got a rocket that's maybe 4 or 5 meters tall, it's quite a big rocket. It's not going to be cheap to launch that and test it to altitude, but it is relatively cheap to launch and test that to a few thousand meters and gain a lot of information from that in the process and learn how it flies, how stable it is. So we'd do things like stability test flights. You'd build subscale rockets, and this is something the UK used to be brilliant at, but again seems to have been forgotten, which is that before you launch your big rocket, you build a half scale flight demonstrator, you build a third scale, you build a quarter scale. And at each stage, starting from the smallest and building up, you're learning the flight characteristics. You make whatever vehicle you're making representative in terms of the masses and the distributions of the masses. So it will fly similarly, whether it's small or large.
Mm.
But by doing that, you can iron out a lot of the bugs in the system. And it saves you a lot of money in the long run. So in some cases, for a few £1,000s or less, you can solve a lot of problems that you might find on a rocket that's going to cost you a few £100,000, but you don't find them out until you launch that big rocket. Now, it's far cheaper to spend a few £1,000s early on and find those problems then and correct them.
Sure.
But that's what doesn't seem to be happening so much with a lot of the new entrants, and I think that in part is due to the fact of this hollowing out of the experience, because there are insufficient people out there who are able to say to them, don't do this because you will make a big mistake. We did this in 1995 and it went bang.
Mhm.
But without that experience to guide them, it becomes a lot harder. And we see that with various companies. I was looking at one recently who were doing something with hybrids, and I just thought, no, that's not going to work. I'm not giving names away there because there's several that are working with hybrids, so it could be any one of them. But it's because they either don't know that there are those of us out there who can help, or they've set themselves up in sort of competition to make it somewhat harder to help. But yeah, that's experience can be built up, but there is no substitute for it.
Mhm.
Practice, practice, practice. Yet, in one of the problems is people think nowadays it's like, I suppose, going on I'm a Celebrity or Love Island or something, that they're gonna be instantly famous.
Yeah, I know.
And space is the same in terms of, in some cases, there people think I'm instantly going to be able to build a rocket, or I'm instantly going to be able to build a CubeSat. It doesn't work like that. You have to put the time in. You have to work. You have to sacrifice your time to make it happen.
Yeah.
And if you do that, you will benefit from it.
Yeah. I have so many questions, but I know
Go
you.
on, go on, go on.
Okay. So I want to ask you about SpaceX and
Okay.
Starship, because the last Starship launch, I have to admit, I cried. But they were happy tears because I was just so happy for them.
It was
Exactly.
glorious, absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad you liked it as well. What do you think about how SpaceX does things? So they they just launch and they hope it will be successful.
Well, I'm very much from that background in terms of rockets anyway.
Hmm.
So I guess I'm going to be biased there in terms of thinking that yes, that is the way. That is the way that I certainly support you. It's like the old X programs
Mhm.
back in the '60s with things like the X-15 and the various other lifting bodies that were developed. You build things, you break them when you test them, you learn from what broke. Um, you iterate very rapidly and you move on. And in doing that, you move further along more rapidly than the competition if the competition isn't following that approach. Um, and I think this is the thing that people are missing, that SpaceX is not just ahead of people, but it's accelerating. And that's the key point that's being missed. And it's like the whole concept of when you're they say that you're putting a grain of sand on a chessboard, and you've got one the first day, then you've got two the next, then four, and so on, and it's doubling and doubling, and you don't notice that advancement necessarily, just how far something is going, until it's reached a tipping point, at which point you're then, oh, we're stuffed.
Mhm.
Uh, and I've been watching that happen with the space industry, with people rubbishing SpaceX for years, and essentially saying, "Oh yeah, well their approach is wrong. It's you can't just doing it by testing like this. Oh no, you've got to follow a more formal process, the old space approach." Um, and I've watched people saying that, and I've said, "You're going to be wrong. No one's listened." And then now you're starting to see the industry go, "Hmm, oh, maybe we'd better move to reusables." It's like, well, hello. There were a fair few of us saying this
Exactly.
um, decades ago, that you need to build in the whole concept of reusability from the outset, um, because we could see the way it was going to have to go, and that's what SpaceX has been absolutely brilliant at, and you look at the big picture and you look at what's achievable,
Mhm.
and it's essentially building an ecosystem, not just to go to Mars, but you're building an entire cislunar ecosystem and economy from it, and that's what makes it so exciting and attractive. I think Blue Origin will do the same with New Glenn. They've taken a more um, sort of quiet approach to it, and a longer term approach, but if you look at where they are now, if all the pieces are coming together, and one of the things you often see with launch vehicles is, to the outside world, it looks like nothing is happening,
Mhm.
and it can be a case that it looks like nothing is happening for years, but that's only because you can't see all the bits inside that are being worked on. And if you're working on them, you know that once everything comes together, it will then move quite rapidly.
Mhm.
And I think that's what we'll see with Blue Origin. Once they get to that point, and they're clearly getting a lot closer, um, that will develop quite quickly. And I think that's where the market's going. It's with the large launch vehicles. Um, there's going to be a place for small sat launch. There has to be, because it provides the ability to launch to specific inclination-specific orbital altitudes, and it puts your satellite, your small sat, exactly where you want it to be.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies are going to be satisfied with just good enough. So they'll be happy to go up on the larger launchers, where the economies of scale are so much greater.
Mhm. Yeah. Back to SpaceX's approach. So I think the American approach is in general, very different from the European approach. So
Yeah,
in Europe, I think we talk about things more and we plan the planning and nothing's happening. But in the US, especially in the private sector, it's much faster.
yeah. There's a number of reasons for that. One is there's a natural caution this side of the Atlantic, and that doesn't help things in terms of speed of development of anything launch related. Secondly, there are political ramifications in terms of various countries and wanting to ensure that their aerospace industries get a decent slice of the pie, and that can be detrimental to launch sort of hopes, and that's something we've seen. We've seen more recently a pivoting towards some of the small reusable launchers in Europe in terms of the focus. And it's great. It's what's needed, but it's about 10 years behind. Well, actually, no, it's more than that. It's more like about 15 years behind. And the time that they needed to be looking at this was in the late 2000s. And I remember being at Reaction Engines where, we were saying that this is what Ariane 6 should be. It should be Skylon.
Mm.
But they've gone down a route that means that Ariane 6 will end up with a very short time span of operation, most likely, because they're going to have to rapidly rush forward to a next generation. Because SpaceX has shown that it can be done. And no one's got any excuse for saying it can't be done now. And that's the key. That the ability to do some of these things has been around since the 70s. But what hasn't been there has been the mindset. People talk about, yes, well, electronics has moved on, avionics has moved on massively since those time frames, and they're right. But what they're missing is the electronics and avionics forms a relatively small part of the overall mass of the vehicle. So using the excuse of, oh, well, we didn't have advanced technology back then, it won't wash, because you look at what SpaceX has got, and it's a stainless steel rocket. Well, Blue Streak, the British Blue Streak, was stainless steel. And that was back in the 60s or the late 50s that they designed that. So it is very much a question of mindset and believing that you can do it. And that's what SpaceX has in abundance.
Oh, yeah.
And I hope that it means that the rest of the industry will develop that same self-belief. And I think that's what's needed in Europe more. It's more self-belief that Europe can do it.
Sure.
Because the talent is there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, last two questions and then I'll let you go. Best type of propulsion for leaving the planet? What would you vote for?
What an excellent question.
Thank you.
And the reason for saying that is, in an ideal world, it would be a space elevator.
Okay, wow. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, because
How
when you
would that work?
Well, the thing is, if you think about it, the elevator is going to be powered by electricity.
Okay.
Um, so at right up in space, at one end, you have a massive solar farm. So essentially, you're using the energy of the sun
Hmm.
to provide the electricity. So the costs of moving things up to space altitudes becomes minimal,
Okay.
and that's an obvious way of doing it. Another way that certainly that I'd favour is air breathing rocket um, space planes, single stage to orbit space planes. But obviously, I'm going to say that because having worked on Skylon, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm a complete believer to it. Um, yeah, I'd say one of those two options. Those are the ideal. Although I suspect it's going to be rather exciting to travel point to point on something like the SpaceX Starship,
Hmm. Yeah.
and that will come. That will come too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I believe it totally. Um, how high up the space elevator would go? Like,
How high up do you want it to go?
okay. Okay.
Um, it's a case of do you want something that's going all the way up to geostationary, um, or do you want something relatively lower? I'm not sure. I think there's a point at which it's not so useful below a certain altitude because there's you've got to think of all the orbital mechanics involved in it. So it would make more sense to make it capable of going a lot higher anyway.
Hmm.
Uh, the obvious place to start is to build a space elevator on the moon because it's a lot easier. You've only got a sixth of the Earth's gravity, and in fact, there have been some concepts that have been put forward for building a lunar space elevator using existing technologies because it's just about doable as I understand it using existing technologies for the moon. Um, from a materials perspective, it's harder with the Earth
Hmm.
um, because obviously we're a much larger rock, um, and that's got all sorts of problems in terms of the material strengths needed. But yeah, that I would say a space elevator would be the ideal.
Okay.
And if you can't have a space elevator, I'd go with a single stage to orbit space plane,
Okay.
just because it's civilized.
Okay. Thank you. Last question, and then I'll let you go. Would you go to Mars if they told you you could go to Mars and come back if you want to come back?
I was going to say if I could come back
Okay.
as well,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd be very interested, but I think it's going to take a while
Oh.
for them to develop the capability for um, people to be able to do that. I think people are very enthusiastic about the timescales, um, and obviously Elon Musk has got very um, aggressive timescales, but engineering is no respecter of enthusiasm.
Mhm.
It's very pragmatic, and you have to think in terms of how long it will actually take, and you can move as fast as you want, and SpaceX proves that people can move remarkably quickly, but you cannot anticipate all the engineering gotchas
Mhm.
along the way. So I think it will take a little bit longer than people think, but I certainly think that um, in the 2030s we will have not just a Mars base, but a fairly substantial facility on Mars, or facilities. It needs cities.
Mhm.
If you're going to go, you might as well go at scale. Otherwise it's little more than just an expedition. And if you want to establish humanity on another planet, which I absolutely agree with Elon Musk that we need to do, then you need to go at a large scale.
Right.
But he's quite right. We need an insurance policy for the planet, and that insurance policy means that we need to have other human outposts or even civilizations on other planets in the solar system. There was a very regressive report that was put out in the early 1970s called The Limits to Growth. And it's caused immense damage for many decades, because it's made us think that essentially it's almost like a we're doomed type thing, and we suffer with that now in terms of the way we look at the planet. But essentially the opposite is the case. If you look at the vast potential of space, then there really are no limits to growth, and there is enough space up there to give everyone on the planet a huge amount of land on a terraformed planet, or eventually moving towards things like Dyson dots, or I think a Dyson sphere is a little way further off. But the potential is there, and we need to build on that. We need to think about the positive applications. There's a lot of negativity, and it's a societal thing that's been around for a couple of decades, and we've got to get over that. We've got to wake up and realize there's an enormous amount of potential, a lot of positive things, and space can enable so many things, not just on Earth, and there are many things on Earth it can help, but in moving people out into the solar system, we need to do it. And the sooner we do it, the better. So I'm on the same side as A, Elon Musk, who wants to set up Mars colonies, and B, Jeff Bezos, who has these ideas for huge orbiting colonies as well. And between them, those are the type of approaches we need to be looking at. We need to think big.
Yeah.
Space is huge. There's plenty of room up there.
Definitely.
So let's address the universe on its own terms instead of small-minded, small thinking. Let's think expansively, think big.
Okay, those were the perfect last words. I'm conscious of our time and that you have to go. I could talk to you for another 2, 3 hours about this. It's fascinating, and maybe we will continue someday.
Yes, absolutely, we should. Just
Thank you
not
very much.
tonight, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much for being with me, talking to me, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed this. I'm going to put a link in below of Spacebar so that people can join. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. It's been brilliant.